Now we will discuss behavior plans and supports by Megan Funk and Jamie Selzer. Our materials today were developed collaboratively with the NDE, Department of Special Education IEP Facilitation Cadre, and ESU 13 staff knowledge and expertise. Your presenters today are Megan Funk and Jamie Selzer. Megan is a speech-language pathologist, a board-certified behavior analyst, and the Nebraska ASD Network Western Region Coordinator.
Jamie Selzer is an occupational therapist that has been at ESU 13 for 10 years. She's also a member of the Western Region ASD team.
Our learning objectives for this part of the presentation are that participants will demonstrate understanding of a behavior intervention plan, identify the 4 sections that behavior needs to be addressed in an IEP, and learn about positive behavior supports and interventions.
When we consider behavior in the case of a child whose behavior does impede his or her learning or that of others, then the IEP team shall consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports and other strategies that address the behavior. So the interventions, supports, and strategies that are considered need to be agreed upon by the team. They need to be best practices and very strategically outlined so that all persons across the student's day can apply them. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, states that an IEP is supposed to address behavior needs regardless of their educational identification. So it's not only for our ED students or students with autism, it's all students that may have behavior impeding their or their peers' learning. So when should we create a BIP or behavior intervention plan? When students exhibit consistent and significant behavior problems that interfere with their learning and or that of others in their class, then we do need to get a behavior intervention plan in place. Please note that just because a student needs a BIP does not mean they require an IEP, and vice versa. Not all students on an IEP need a BIP. A behavior intervention plan can stand all on its own. It doesn't require an IEP for the student. Why complete a behavior intervention plan? A behavior intervention plan really is an individualized plan for success for the student. And when we get teachers, support staff, the student and parents involved, it helps us to increase support around the student. This then provides a very intensive intervention plan and allows for solid monitoring. It also helps us to address very specific issues in a systematic manner because it's all written out in black and white. It helps teachers to address the behaviors and issues very consistently across subjects, rooms, and sessions. Do I need to do a functional behavior assessment? Let's figure it out. Please note that behavior that results in the removal of a student for 10 days, whether it's cumulative, consecutive, or non-consecutive, from their least restrictive environment, determined by the IEP team, requires a manifest determination. And if the behavior is determined to be a result of the student's disability, then we do need to conduct a functional behavior assessment and get a BIP written or completed, or we need to review and revise the current BIP. Is the student's behavior impeding the learning of themselves or others? If we can answer no to that, then we do not need to do an FBA or write a BIP. We can just make sure that our Tier 1 supports are absolutely in place so that the student is able to really succeed in our classroom. If we can answer maybe or yes to is the student's behavior impeding the learning of themselves or others, then we really need to consider our Tier 1 strategies and supports. Are they in place, rock solid? We are implementing things accurately and with consistency, and considered some Tier 2 supports as well. We want to really specify those positive behavioral strategies. We want to start to collect baseline data so that we can start to determine if any of these positive behavioral strategies are helping, because really an intervention is only as successful as bringing about the positive behavior change. So we want to make sure that we have the data to support those different interventions that we have already tried or are trying. If the interventions are effective, then we're just going to continue on in those tier 1 and tier 2 supports. But if we find that they are ineffective and we are still continuing to have the student's behavior impeding the learning of themselves or others, then we need to consider what the function of that behavior is. If we have a clear idea of hypothesized function, then we could move directly to developing the behavior intervention plan. If we aren't 100% sure or we do not know the function of the behavior, then we do not want to guess. We would want to do the functional behavior assessment and then begin to develop the behavior intervention plan based on the information that we gather from the FBA. Then after we have the FBA and or the BIP, we would look at the data again and look to see, are the interventions that we wrote in there, are they effective? And if they are, then we can continue until the criteria determined in the behavior intervention plan is met and the student's behavior is no longer impeding their learning. If it's ineffective, we can review that FBA and make sure that we do have the right function, and then we can revise the BIP to make changes according to the data. But we are always making decisions that are data-driven. We've determined our student needs a behavior intervention plan, so what should it include? We need to first make sure that there is a definition of behavior that's being targeted. It needs to be measurable and observable so that anybody walking in would know exactly what the behavior was that they were looking for. After we document the definition of the behavior, we want to know exactly what the function the behavior is serving. So is the function escape, avoid, attention, access to tangibles and activities, or is it sensory automatic? We can also note if it's more than one function, if it's multifunctional, but we need to have that documented. We then look at the plan for communication between home and school. We know that one of the most important ways to address behavior is for very successful communication to be going on between home and school. This will help us to also address any setting events, if the student has had a poor night's sleep, missed their medication, something along that line. We then look at positive proactive strategies. These are things that we are going to set into place to try to encourage the student to make appropriate choices and discourage them to make or use the old or inappropriate behavior. So we're going to have a whole list of positive proactive strategies that everybody's going to really work towards to encourage these new behaviors. Then we have to also look at what behaviors need to be directly taught to meet the function. If the function is escape avoid, we may need to directly teach how to ask for a break. If they are seeking attention, do they know how to gain attention by calling out your name or raising their hand? If they're trying to gain access to tangibles and activities, do they know how to ask for the items by name? Or if it's sensory automatic, can they tell you if it's too loud or they need more light, something on that line. Vocal output, using an AAC device, using a picture device. It doesn't matter what mode of communication, we would just want them to know how to ask for a break appropriately. We then want to look at how a student will be reinforced for that appropriate behavior. We know that the most effective way to have a behavior maintain or increase over time is when it's reinforced. So the student's communication is already being reinforced and it's getting them what they want. We just want to make sure that we're reinforcing the new behavior that we are replacing or directly teaching them. So if they were able to escape and avoid and get out of their work through the meltdown, we now want to make sure that they can take the break immediately after they ask for the break. So we want to allow that escape avoidance after they've asked for the break appropriately. We also want to make sure how to decrease the possible reinforcement of the inappropriate behaviors. So if they had been able to escape and avoid by melting down to the floor, we want to make sure that if they try to melt down to the floor, we can quick redirect and say, remember, you can take a break, and get them to touch that card or say the word break or sign the word break. We only want to reinforce that new behavior of asking for a break. And finally, we want to look at our data. How are we going to keep our data? We want to keep it simple so that everybody is able to read it and keep it. We want to make sure that our plan, our interventions to build up the student's effective communication is very successful for the student. So if we look at the data and we don't see success, then we need to quick make some tweaks and make sure that what we are doing is effective for the student's ability to learn these different effective ways of communication. Karen Hossey had some suggestions for behavior intervention plans when she presented Back to Basics in November at the Tri-State SPED Law Conference. And she suggested that we remember that this plan is for positive behavioral supports. It's not a code of conduct. We want to make sure that we are helping to improve the students' behavior to encourage them through these positive behavioral supports. We also need to review a possible menu of these supports and make sure that they are meeting that hypothesized function that we put in that behavior plan. So if it's attention or escape avoid, access to tangibles activities, or sensory automatic, then we want to make sure that the supports that we're using are meeting those needs. She also gave some suggestions, the Intervention Central, Autism Speaks, and then I also put in PBIS World is a very good one to look at menus if you're not for sure what different behavioral supports meet specific functions. We also need to make sure that we understand that the use of a school-wide behavior program may not be sufficient for our student with severe behavior. Our students may need to be even more individualized to make sure that just because you are using a school-wide behavior program, that does not mean that your student doesn't need a BIP. We also want to distinguish between seclusion and cool down. We may have a specific room, but what are we using it for? Is it a refocus room? Is it specifically for a place of privacy? Is it a timeout room? There are different reasons that we use the room, and so we want to make sure that everybody on the team knows if you need any support whatsoever with this BIP, please consult a school psychologist, a board-certified behavior analyst, or your service provider. School psychologists and board-certified behavior analysts can complete functional behavior assessments. Your service providers would be fantastic also to look at what direct teaching techniques need to be used, what goals to work towards. And then we always want to consider review of the language that we use when we are chatting with our parents. If you have a student who is on an IEP, an individual education program, and they also need a BIP, a behavior intervention plan, then we need to address 4 areas on the IEP. We will look at special considerations specific to behavior. We'll look at the PLAF, or present level of academic achievement and functional performance. We will look at the goals, and we will look at program modifications and accommodations. Please note, though, that you do not have to include the full BIP in the IEP. We're only going to make notes about the BIP within the IEP, but it doesn't have to be fully included. We can also put information about the behavior intervention plan on a notes page as well. Special consideration specific to behavior. This is the box that says if behavior impedes learning, consideration of the use of positive behavior interventions and strategies. So we want to leave this box blank. The box says considered but not necessary. Well, for our student, it is necessary. And so we are going to put information into this box that describes how our student's behavior does impede learning. So on this, earlier I described different items that our BIP should have in it. And if you have a BIP that marks or checks all of those boxes, then you might have a statement such as the example given. The IEP team has determined that John's behavior impedes his and or his class's learning. The behavior intervention plan has been implemented to address the hypothesized function of, and then we would put either escape avoid, attention, access to tangibles and activities, or sensory automatic. The team is working to use positive behavior supports and strategies, direct teaching of new behaviors to meet the function, and the use of reinforcement for consistency and maintenance of new behaviors. We're not putting all of the specifics in. Remember, the full BIP does not have to be in the IEP. The BIP is a working document that we are looking at the data all the time. We're taking data daily, we're looking at the data weekly, and we want to make sure that we have the ability to use this document very, very consistently and not having to call an IEP meeting every single time we look at the data. In the PLAF, or present level of academic achievement and functional performance, we want to include what the student is in need of by describing what direct teaching needs to take place or has been taking place to train in the new behavior. We want to describe what positive behavior strategies have been implemented as well to also meet the function, and then we always provide data. In this example, we put John is participating in direct teaching of raising his hand to gain attention. He has improved his use of raising his hand to gain attention from 5% to 60% of opportunities. The staff are providing 10 plus positive specific praises throughout his day to proactively meet his need for attention. This was very basic and minimal. This is simply an example, but you could easily discuss what professionals are doing the direct teaching of the raising hands. Is it resource? Is it SLP? Is it paraprofessionals? When we talk about the opportunities that he's given, he's from 5% to 60%. What settings is he in? Is he in the resource classroom? Is he in the regular ed classroom? Does he require any prompting? Does he have visual aid available? So it can get a lot more detailed. In the example, we just wanted to demonstrate that direct teaching is taking place to meet the function. Positive behavior strategies have been implemented to meet the function, and that data is being kept. The PLAF is where you would also address shortened school days. Please notice that we did not put this under special consideration specific to behavior. The shortened school days would be under the PLAF. Let's see why. Shortening a student's day. The long story short is behavior is not a valid reason to shorten a student's day. And NDE has a fantastic guidance doc to shorten days, but let's look at what it states. It says appropriate uses of a shortened day. The only time that it is appropriate to shorten the school day for a student with a disability is when the student's IEP team determines a shortened day is required to address the student's unique disability-related needs. For example, if because the student's medical needs, the student is physically unable to tolerate a full school day, a shortened day may be appropriate. Before deciding to shorten the student's day, the IEP team must consider if there are other ways to meet the student's needs. When a student's school day is shortened, the student's IEP must include an explanation of why the student's disability-related needs required the shortened day, and a plan for the student's return to school for a full day, including a plan to meet more frequently to review student data and determine whether the student is able to return to school full-time. The student should return to a full day of school as soon as he or she is able, and under most circumstances, a shortened school day should be in place for only a limited amount of time. Remember, it should only be based on the student's disability-related needs. The IEP team must meet as often as necessary to review the plan and to determine when the student is able to return to school full-time. Some procedural questions to consider. Must an IEP team meeting be held before the school district shortens the length of a student's school day? The answer to that is yes. Shortening a student's school day is a decision that must be made through the IEP team process, and it must be the student's entire team. How should a shortened school day be documented in the student's IEP? The IEP must include a clear description of the special education services, related services, and supplementary aids and services to be provided, including the amount, frequency, location, and duration of the services. The team would explain the total length of the school day and describe the extent that the team would meet to discuss the student's plan to return to an increased school day. The document helps us to see why shortened days should be information that is specifically put into the PLAF and not special considerations specific to behavior. The document lets us know that it's really due to the student's unique disability-related needs and not that of behavior. When we consider our federal laws, free and appropriate public education, or FAPE, or least restrictive environment, LRE, we need to look or consider that shortened days are not positive behavior interventions or supports. In fact, shortened days may actually be a denial of a student's FAPE. So we want to make sure that we understand that LRE is about working through the continuum, not about having a student earn their way back, but it's really about utilizing those supplementary aids and services and supports to help our student to utilize the least restrictive environment. In the goals section, we want to look at what we want to train in, what we want the student to do more of. So our goals are not going to be specific to decreasing a behavior, because decreasing a behavior is not really teaching anything. It's what we want to directly teach that we would want to put into the goal. So your team may choose to have a behavior goal that comes from what they have determined in the BIP needs to be directly taught to meet that function. For example, John will improve his ability to gain attention appropriately by raising his hands in 9 out of 10 opportunities with 100% accuracy. He either raises his hand or doesn't, right? And he is going to be practicing this in those 36 instructional weeks. So he will raise his hand or not raise his hand. That's measurable and observable, and he's going to do that in 9 out of the 10 opportunities given. The non-example goal would be that Johnny will decrease his blurting out from 5 times a day to 2 times a day. That would not be actual training that we're going to do. The training that we want to do, the goal we want to increase more of, is his gaining attention appropriately by raising his hand. So make sure that we are using goals that we want to see more of.
And then an example goal using sensory tools. Being the OT, I don't always do specific sensory goals. I like to incorporate them. kind of behavior we want to see. So, for instance, Johnny will improve his attention to tasks. So, attention being kind of our more specific behavior we are wanting to see from 2 minutes to 5 minutes with use of sensory supports during 3 out of 5 opportunities in 4 weeks. So, I don't get too specific with sensory supports in the goal. You can put maybe more specific supports down in the objectives, such as use of weighted vest, weighted lap pad, use of fidgets. So you can address those more in the objectives, but I like to keep the goal fairly open, just use of sensory supports, because those can change from day to day depending on what you're using. IEP goals and services must address the following. So tolerating any changes in schedules, addressing maladaptive behaviors. So kind of if they're replacing those positive behaviors with the negative, addressing what those positive behaviors look like. Addressing anxiety and any calming or regulation strategies. So if you are incorporating sensory supports, that should be included. Strategies to obtain needed breaks. So are they using a break card? Are they raising their hand? Giving a thumbs up type of strategies that should be incorporated into the goals, and teaching the use of schedules. Modifications and accommodations. So this area should include any modification or accommodation specific to this student. If it's available for every child, it does not have to go into this area. So just for instance, sensory supports that this student may be using, such as fidgets, flexible seating, which is usually offered to most children, weighted vests, etc., that are student specific, and then visual supports would be in this area of any kind, such as a visual schedule, first then type of schedule, any visual schedules that student may be using. So some examples of positive behavior interventions and supports. The PBIS World link, that's a great resource for some behavior interventions and supports, and maybe ideas for meeting the function of a more negative behavior. And then you always want to match the intervention with the function of the behavior. And then sensory activities and supports. I am always recommending that you kind of dig into that sensory piece with students that you're having some more difficult behaviors with. Sensory is a big piece. It really impacts kiddos and their behaviors. So I would really recommend involving your occupational therapist and getting those sensory checklists completed. And just a little bit about sensory processing and use of sensory supports. Like I had said, seeing a lot more of this in the schools and the homes. Basically, sensory processing differences is the inability to accurately register and process and react to sensory input. So we do see a lot of negative responses if somebody's not processing that sensory input appropriately. So, these kind of behaviors can really interfere with participation in the classroom. So therefore, they're seeing that avoidance of something as a more negative response, a behavior response, when really it's a sensory response. So it's just really important to take a look at that sensory piece, and then consulting with your OT, of course, if you feel like that's a concern, filling out the sensory checklist and finding out what those needs are. Every child is very, very different. So you can't just kind of generalize a sensory plan. It really has to be specific to that student. And then addressing sensory into the IEP, like I said, identifying what those sensory needs are, and writing that down in the present level. Usually the OT will do that if you have an OT involved. And always using positive language and then providing data to identify this as a concern. So that's where that sensory checklist comes into play. I already kind of talked about that sensory goal piece is relating it to a skill or, like transitions or attention to task, things like that. And then, making sure it's measurable and within an appropriate time frame. And of course, if not all students get that sensory support, you really need to place that into the accommodations. That concludes the behavior plans and supports section. Thank you so much. And to receive professional developmental credit through ESU, please fill out the following Google form on this link, and then it's linked in the comments below the video. Thank you.